by Magnus Carlsen's high standards, 2018 was not his best year. He came second in a couple of events to Fabiano Caruana, for example, the Grenka tournament. He won Shamkir, and then he was second in Norway Chess again to Fabiano Caruana. And it felt as though Magnus wasn't entirely comfortable and was maybe feeling the heat of his challenger for the world title. Caruana had won through the candidates in March 2018 and seemed to be playing incredibly well, even better than Carlsen in some of these tournaments. So maybe Carlsen was feeling the pressure of Caruana. I saw him in a couple of events live, so to speak, and he was nervous. There was something that wasn't quite right. I was commentator in Biel in that summer where Carlsen only came second to Mamedyarov. And something wasn't quite right with him. However, Carlsen did manage to defend his title in November in 2018. Just very close contest with Fabiano. But defending his title, I think, must have been an incredible relief to him. And 2019, well, that was a very different story. And I want to show you a game from January 2019 and the Tata Steel tournament, which Carlsen won. And his play really took on a different tone. He was playing really adventurously. It was like 2018 had been thrown off his back, and he was playing with daring, with adventure, and really going for it in a lot of games. So I want to show you this round 8 game from the Tata Steel tournament. Carlsen is white, and he's playing Richard Rapport, the very talented Hungarian player, who of course is younger than Carlsen. So I think it's very interesting that Carlsen is prepared to go in for an open Sicilian. This is a risk, particularly against someone as creative as Richard Rapport. And Carlsen is playing with white, well, quite a main line as well. G3, I have to say, has a very solid reputation. It has a good reputation. The bishop comes to G2, which protects that potentially weak pawn on E4. A6. I should mention that this Tata Steel tournament, Carlsen actually started with 4 draws, but then things came good. And yeah, this is round 8. So all normal so far. And here Black has a choice. I mean, maybe the most reliable move for Black is to take on D4 and play bishop C5. Although Carlsen, it's very interesting, Carlsen doesn't always play main lines, but he clearly knows main lines very well, and he actually had this in a game in 2021. So knight takes d4 is possible. One can also play with bishop e7, and well, this is known to be quite promising for white actually. But Rapport played very quickly d6, a very standard move. So Black is playing this so-called Scheveningen setup with pawns here. And here rook e1 is the most popular move. But Carlsen thought for about 3.5 minutes and played knight takes c6. So it's a little bit unusual, although what he does now is quite standard in a way. At least the theme is standard. So obviously not queen takes, which would allow pawn here, opening up the bishop, but pawn takes. And normally one doesn't, with white, one shouldn't exchange on c6, because bringing that pawn close to the center brings, gives Black another center pawn and makes the center even stronger. But let's look at Carlsen's idea. Knight here. So the knight, of course, can no longer be driven away. And this makes room for the c pawn. So this is quite a common idea, if not in this position, but in similar positions. Rook b8 from Rapport, just taking the rook off this diagonal, and pawn to c4. So this is the big idea, that this pawn comes up, and it's a kind of Marozzi bind, and it's not so easy for black to break this. If we put this pawn here, well, obviously the c file will be open, but in many cases that b pawn can attack the pawn on c4. Obviously, with the pawn here, that pawn is actually, well, sort of relatively secure. Pawn c5. To generate play in this position, black really needs to be able to drive that knight away and then to advance the a pawn to put some pressure here. So c5 makes sense. It also blocks white's c pawn. Otherwise, sometimes pawn to c5 could be nice. b3. Yes, what have I written here? Magnus likes a fixed pawn structure. Absolutely. When you have a fixed pawn structure, it's more easy to determine where your pieces should stand because there's no sort of dynamic pawn break. And that really suits Carlsen. He loves maneuvering. Rapport develops the kingside and the castles. Yeah, about time. But Carlsen has managed to put his bishop on this fantastic diagonal. Now that has real potential, as we're going to see. Well, perhaps you'd like to think, how would you play this position with white? If you can see the notation, that kind of spoils it, so you can always click that off. I just find it interesting the way that Carlsen plays this. I can imagine many players that would just play queen d2 without thinking. Carlsen played queen e1 after about 11 minutes thought, and this is so typical of him. He's playing with a very clear plan. He's in a rush. He wants to play e5, which after this pawn exchange would leave that pawn on c5 without pawn protection. So it would that pawn push e5 would isolate the pawn on c5. So that's a very nice idea from a positional point of view. So knight d7, I think from Rapport, is a very understandable move, preempting this move. And now rook d1, the rook comes over, so the queen has made room for that rook, and obviously the d file is an important file for the rook. Bishop b7, and now a little bit of shuffling, queen c3, threatening mate. Now, if the knight comes back, once again we can see that this pawn exchange is actually rather favourable for white. That bishop is a rotten piece, tied to defending that pawn. This bishop has potential to come around here. White is just better, positionally better. Therefore, bishop f6, blocking the diagonal, and the queen nudges back. But now that d pawn is threatened, so the bishop has to come back to defend it. And now, well, Carlsen just shuffles for a couple of moves, repeats the position, and now he's ready to make progress. And he goes for it. Pawn to f4. So while he has control in the center, he realizes, right, now I have time to press on. And this is a very important moment in the game because Carlsen, well, he has a couple of ideas. He might push the f pawn, but it's more likely that he wants to continue with his plan of advancing that e pawn. Basically, that pawn will carve out territory. It will also open the d file, and that pawn push will also weaken the pawn on c5. So it's kind of an extension of this e5 plan we've seen already. Well, how should black meet that? It's not easy. I mean, the move I would like to make is bishop c6, drive this knight back, and then push this a pawn, start a minority attack to get counterplay here, but black just doesn't have time for this move. Pawn to e5. You'll notice that there's actually a terrible pin here. So, you know, obviously pawn takes pawn, bishop takes, and then queen takes knight, wins a piece. So bishop c6 is just too slow. What about rook d8, protecting that knight. Well, now a really nice move, bishop c3, threatening bishop a5, and that is very awkward. At the very least, white is going to be able to drive the rook away from the d file. Rook e8 is possible. And after this, takes, king takes g2, but you can see again, those pieces are lined up beautifully and black is in some trouble there. That's why Rapport, after 12 minutes, played pawn to e5, blocking that e-pawn. Well, it's perhaps an understandable move, but it's not a beautiful move. I'm sure he was very reluctant to play that because it leaves that d5 square weaker. But at least it does block out that bishop on b2. That's important. Bishop c3, nice move. So that bishop prepares to come in here. It's a nice creeping move. Bishop c6, bishop a5, and there's room for the knight to come back to c3, looking at that wonderful d5 square. Now, rook e8 is possible, but then knight d5, black should probably exchange this off, but I mean this is a very comfortable position for white to play. It's important that there's no rook on the d file. You can see that bishop does a really good job, and you can imagine some pressure here on the d file. I mean, we could be building up potentially for an exchange sack. That's an idea, and maybe later on that bishop can cut here. I've got to watch out for e4. That's the only problem. Okay, back to this position. So Carlsen's just played knight c3. Pawn takes pawn from Rapport. He doesn't want to find himself in one of those passive positions in an endgame. So he's keen to open up the position. Understandable, because white's king's a little bit exposed now. And Rapport is ready to drop the bishop and get some pressure here. So here is where Carlsen strikes. If you hang around, there could be a few problems. Another idea for black is to play the bishop here, looking at that d4 square for the bishop. So Carlsen strikes. He loves playing with the initiative. He loves taking the fight to his opponent. This is so typical of him. And watch what happens now. Bishop takes, queen takes. Now, if the queens are exchanged, then you can see there's a terrible pin on the d file, and white must be winning. So pawn takes pawn. So if queen takes queen, rook takes, and everything is still protected here. So knight, what's Carlsen going to do? This is so interesting. Basically, he's given up a pawn. Knight d5, but it's all about getting his pieces to fantastic squares. And suddenly, we thought he was playing in the middle, but actually he's turned his attention to the king side. And that queen is now way out of play. And in fact, as we're going to see, is a tactical liability. How should black defend this? Well, let's see what happens first of all if... let me say first of all that Rapport played e4. But let's look at what happens on e takes f4 first. Well, it's incredible how white's pieces just flood over to the king side. Watch this. Well, first a little tactic. Bishop f8, rook takes, knight check, and queen takes queen. Fine, that's a nice tactic, but Carlsen would have known this very well, of course. That's part of his reckoning. So knight f8. So the bishop is defended, and now rook takes. And this is impossible to defend. Basically, Carlsen has managed to open all the files. All his pieces look good, and we're just waiting for this bishop to drop back, and it's game over. For example, okay, let's play something typical. Knight e6 looks very plausible. Bishop here, threat, rook takes, and queen takes g7 mate. If the bishop drops back, then we've got knight f6 check, and that forks king and rook. Bishop here, well, we just pile up and force open the g file, and you can see every single one of white's pieces is taking part in the attack. Okay, so after knight d5, Rapport tried to close lines. Carlsen brought the bishop back, bishop c3. attacking here, and Rapport played f6, shutting out that bishop. And Carlsen just switches over to the king side. So he's just playing for the attack now, and with black's pieces way across the other side of the board, this is understandable. All white's pieces in play. This is a wonderful position. King h8, rook g1, threatening mate. Bishop f8. And here's a fascinating moment. Carlsen is a pawn down. He's given up a pawn for the attack. But he understands that actually, if he plays correctly, black is absolutely helpless in this position. So he could just reclaim his pawn like this. But that would simplify the position. You know, black has chances to defend there, and you know that pawn has potential. So what did Carlsen play? Knight e3. Play that after just 2.5 minutes thought. This knight move is superb. It's so simple, it's so clever. First of all, it blockades the e-pawn, and with that e-pawn stuck on e4, then the queen and the rook are stuck out of play. They're just biting on their own soldier. No good. The knight also makes room for the rook to come across. And we have every single one of white's pieces taking part in the attack. Whereas for black, just look at this knight. It can't move anywhere. The only place it can move is b6, and that is a pretty useless square. And that knight just gets in the way. Queen e6. Rook h5. So Carlsen just swinging across to the king side. Queen h3, threatening to take here. g6 was played, which obviously g6 weakens black on this diagonal. Instead, it was possible to play h6, but knight f5, and actually white can play this very simply. You can crash through here, but actually rook h4 with the idea of rook g4, actually black is not going to survive this one. Okay, let's go back. g6 played. The rook comes back. And there's really no defense here. Rook b6, so Rapport trying to defend here. f5, well, if g5, that gets taken, because of course there's a pin here. Knight e5, and now the knight returns to d5 because it's attacking the rook and attacking that sensitive point. And if g5, you can just take here. And positionally, you can see this is absolutely crushing with that knight under fire. And we're just left with this wonderful knight against this terrible bishop. So the rook is attacked. Rook d6. Pawn takes. And now Carlsen finishes with a nice tactical flourish. Can you spot it? White's playing win. Here we go. Bishop takes pawn on f6. If king g8, then we can take here and win the queen. And in the game, rook takes, and now the final move was rook takes h7 check. Here, Rapport resigned. If queen takes rook, takes, and there's a lovely finish, a knight fork, and white is the exchange up with a completely winning endgame. A wonderful attack from Carlsen. He sensed that he was going to break through after this move e5. So very logical play. e5 opening things up. But I find it interesting that how he switched from the middle to the king side, and then this move was an absolute star move. Knight e3, a wonderful move, the kind of move that's very easy to overlook if you're a defender, but actually black is completely helpless after that because he can't break through into white's position, he can't exchange pieces, it just cripples black completely. So a wonderful mix of positional play and a grasp of tactics at the end, of course. And in that Tata Steel tournament in January 2019, Carlsen, I think, felt liberated. That's what came across in his play. He was prepared to take great risks. And he said that he'd actually been influenced by the play of AlphaZero. AlphaZero at that time was a new entity, and he'd been impressed by the daring play of this monster artificial intelligence machine learning, I should say. It's not different kind of AI. Anyway, more from Carlsen in 2019 coming up in the next game.